I've been raring to get my hands on the Bang & Olufsen Stage, an all-in-one soundbar that has Dolby Atmos support. In this review, you can be comparing it to its rivals and furthermore seeing if its starting asking price of £1,500 in the UK and $2,000 in the US is actually worth its price tag. Now I really do mean in terms of a starting asking price, because if you go up to different finishes and different colors, then you're going to be having to spend more money. Now nevertheless, whichever one you go for, you'll actually find that it's very stylish. It's got that sort of Scandinavian type of design to it, and I'm all for it. Now, initially, I was a little bit concerned to see how this would actually fit in front of my television, because it might obscure some vision. So, for example, the likes of the Sennheiser Ambeo had this problem. But thankfully here, due to its sleek design, it means that it doesn't actually obscure any of my lower field vision of my television. Of course, it might differ depending on your TV stand or the way you've actually got it mounted. So you might want to check the dimensions online. On that note, it is worth bearing in mind that this soundbar can be wall mounted and of course be placed on a cabinet like I have. It seems to be the most favorable way of actually having this soundbar is actually having it wall mounted, and we'll touch upon why due to its driver configuration. Now for you to interact with the soundbar, there's some touch-based input that are found towards the right hand side of the soundbar. I would have preferred physical buttons instead, because this can prevent mistouch operations. Now you might be wondering, how do you control it from afar? Well, here you'll have to resort to using the app, which we're going to touch upon very shortly. And unfortunately here, Bang & Olufsen have not included a physical remote, which might be a little bit off-putting to certain individuals. So moving on to the app, if we were to tap on the stage, you'll be able to see what is currently playing, play and pause and adjust the volume. And then you've got the different listening modes, which would automatically go on what settings you've set, and I'll showcase this a little bit later on. It's worth bearing in mind that every single mode over here has got its own EQ preset, which is great to see, and furthermore has got a few functions such as upmix, virtualize, low frequency effects tuning and content processing. There's some detailed information from B&O's website, so I'm not going to reiterate it, so therefore you can pause the video in case you're interested to find out more about it. But of course that will very much depend on the content that you're watching. Now as for the equalizer over here, it's a global EQ. In my case, I've added 4 notches to treble and taken 1 notch off the bass. As for the sound settings, you can adjust the default volume, maximum volume, and more importantly, change its position, be it if you've wall mounted it or in my case, placed it on, let's say, a cabinet or a table. So this is very much important for you to get the best out of the B&O Stage. As for loudness, I would leave this enabled, but of course your mileage may vary depending on your own hearing profile and your own settings. Now you can go onto standby by tapping the on and off toggle, which is found at the top, and if you were to tap the 3 little buttons, we can go into product settings. Now the product settings are actually pretty comprehensive. First off, you can see what the source or the sound info is. So for example, the channel allocation and what is actually picking up. You can then go towards the sources. Now here's a comprehensive list of sources that the stage actually does support. And then over here, you can select between the different modes that I just mentioned. So for example, if it does pick up a TV source, it'll automatically go to the EQ that you've set. So for example, if we go on TV, this can be quite handy without you having to manually do this each time, because the stage is actually pretty clever in picking up correctly what the actual source is, and I do find this quite intuitive. Furthermore, also I should mention that you've got a lip sync which you can enable or disable depending on terms of the sort of problems or no problems that you might have. As for the remote controls, this is for you to pair up a B&O remote, and as for the in-app remotes, this is to be with the LG, so I don't really have that, but I had no problems with my Samsung remote, the Samsung One, and therefore adjusting the volume on the fly out of the box. I didn't need to do any sort of pairing. You can rename it, check for software, enable or disable Google Chromecast, change the product color, in other words, the look of it in terms of what is on the main screen. And then you've also got a further layer, which is the configuration. Now, a lot of these settings we've already covered, but there are certain settings over here which you might not have seen. For example, the maximum playback time. So in other words, when you are no longer using it, as to if it's going to go on standby or not. So it's a useful feature. And then you can go on, let's say, power saving and also go on to local operations. So effectively, it's an extra layer of customization if you need it. Now, as for the user interface, it's actually quite intuitive. If you were to tap the bottom over here, you can see what is playing, adjust the volume yet again. But if we tap the little 3 buttons over here, you can quickly change input, which might not be quite intuitive at first, but as soon as you find a setting, it means that if you do want to go, for example, to tune in radio via this, you can just open up the app and quickly switch it, and it does work very, very well. Elsewhere, if you do have other B&O products, you can find it in via the multi-room setup over here. And then also you have got music, or shall we say other services that you can have. So for example, if you have Deezer or let's say Spotify Connect or even DLNA, you can also enable it via this. Of course, you'll have to set it up on your own side. And then you've also got built-in tune-in and also B&O radio if you want to add a station, for example, and add it to the B&O stage so you can play it at any given time. Now, in order to connect up to the app, it should be pretty obvious, but you do have Wi-Fi support, both in 2.4 and 5 GHz frequency bands. You do also have Chromecast, AirPlay 2 and Spotify Connect, which are all very much appreciated and that I touched upon just in the app section before. Elsewhere, you do have Bluetooth, although you only want to resort to this as a sort of last case scenario because it will give you degraded audio performance due to the overall audio codecs that it's running at. Now, of course, you do have wired connectivity, and here you do have a 3.5mm jack, which can be useful for more legacy devices, such as, let's say, a turntable. And then you do also have an HDMI input and output. The latter does support ARC and eARC, which is great for uncompressed Dolby Atmos data, and of course if your television supports it. And as for the input, you do have 4K HDR at 50 to 60 Hz support, so therefore it won't be a limitation if you're connecting up a 4K Blu-ray player. So with all of that in mind, let's get on to a sound demo. I'll be playing back a song which is from Priya J, it's titled Falling, and then we'll be also going on to a piece to camera whereby we'll be presenting the Hyundai Kona Electric on Totally EV. Do check out the annotations towards the bottom of the screen to understand the settings that the stage is actually running on. That is a good inclusion, but yet again, in comparison to what else you can find out there, specifically from the Hyundai group, whereby you have got the ability to have a true one-pedal driving approach, well, that's not quite the case. You'll have to resort to using the flappy paddle each time you want to come to a complete standstill, or of course press on the regular or traditional brake pedal. Now, with the audio demo out of the way, I should just also point out the driver configuration. And here you have got 4 4-inch woofer drivers, 4 1.5-inch full range drivers, and 3 3/4-inch tweeter drivers, each of which combines to 50 watts of total power output, and therefore means that you've got up to 550 watts of power. The frequency range is quoted from 32 Hz all the way up to 22 kHz. So moving swiftly on, we get onto the metadata support, and here you've got Dolby Atmos, Dolby Digital and PCM support. However, there is no support for DTS or DTSX, which is quite a shame and might throw off some video files from the B&O stage altogether. Now, with all of that, let's get on to my subjective opinion. And first off, let's talk about that sub-bass extension. Now, as you might have noticed throughout this review, I haven't mentioned a subwoofer. And indeed, there is no included subwoofer, nor the option to actually add one in, at least not from what I'm aware, nor at the time of filming, which might be a little bit of a concern to certain individuals. I'll explain why there's some pros and cons to this. First off, the overall pros that is the fact that you have an all-in-one system. You don't have to worry about a dedicated subwoofer unit. Furthermore, the stage actually does extend all the way down to 33 Hz, which is actually very impressive. And if you put it across in comparison to other flagship soundbars, which do have a dedicated subwoofer unit, you will actually find that the stage does compete like for like with them. However, there is a big thing to consider, is that these drivers that are positioned within the stage have their work cut out, and therefore the woofer drivers which are producing that low-end extension also have to produce the mid-bass as well, and of course you then have the mid-range and the highs, although you have got dedicated drivers for that. What that means is that when you are treated with music or, for example, movies that have a lot of low-end emphasis and also, let's say, dialogue, you'll find that the soundbar is somewhat struggling to keep up with the different frequencies that are coming out. A dedicated subwoofer unit would have completely alleviated this issue and meant that you would have had a superior sub-bass extension and or one that is a little bit more pleasurable or a bit more dynamic to listen to. Now, on the flip side, the mid-bass is perfect, so I had no problems whatsoever. It's crisp, it's precise, and it's also very punchy. So much so, I did dial down one notch on the bass EQ through the app. Of course, this will very much depend on your own hearing profile and as to how you've actually set up the B&O Stage. Now, moving on, we get on to the mids. And here I would say it's one of its fortes. The mids come out to the foreground and it's not drowned out. In comparison to, for example, Samsung's flagship products, here the B&O Stage just comes out a little bit more lively when it comes to listening to, let's say, Priya J's vocals, or even back to piece the cameras, for example, when I was presenting the Hyundai Kona Electric on Totally EV. Now, yet again, do bear in mind my comments I made about the sub-bass tones and how that affects the rest of the frequency range, but if we're treating the frequency range individually, then the mids are actually very impressive, both in terms of lower mids and upper mids. As for the highs, they extend extremely well. I did have to add a few notches to the treble EQ in order to get that extra bit of zing and life from it, and in this respect, added 4 notches to the treble EQ, made me actually quite enjoy the music and the content that I was watching via the B&O Stage. So with the sound frequency range out of the way, which is actually pretty impressive across the board, what about when it comes to its soundstage? Well, first off, I'm going to give you a little audio demo. I'll be playing back Transformers Age of Extinction, and I'll be going through the different metadatas. Do check out the annotations down below to understand which mode the B&O Stage is actually running on. Now, appreciating audio demo over YouTube is never ideal, so let me get onto my subjective opinion. First off, in terms of that increased metadata, in other words Dolby Atmos, it is certainly appreciated as it gives you a bit more extra nuances and height information over the likes of Dolby Digital or PCM, although it should be no surprise at this price point. Do bear in mind what I said before, that it does not support DTS or DTSX. Now, as for the overall other competencies, well, it's pretty much cut short. It's got a lackluster soundstage reproduction in comparison to other flagship soundbars at this price point. See here, its competitors offer upward, sideward and front-facing drivers, and also offer a wider degree of driver configuration and better channel configurations too. By that I mean the B&O Stage is limited to 11 drivers and 3 channels only, which is quite disappointing at this price point. Furthermore, you have no inclusion of rear drivers, nor do you have that subwoofer as I did mention before, all of which do have a hindrance in terms of the overall cinematic experience and the overall soundstage that one can attain. Now, I should also mention that in my setup, I have it positioned on a TV and therefore on a cabinet, and this does have an effect, because here when I did place some books behind in the soundbar and therefore positioned it forward facing, and of course went through the app to change in terms of its configuration, I felt a lot more engaged with the music I was listening to, and of course when I was consuming movies, I just felt that it was a little bit bettered. It still is no competition to its competitors, but it just should be mentioned over here that Bang & Olufsen really truly wants you to wall mount it, and if you can't wall mount it, then ultimately you're going to be left disappointed like I was in terms of the overall competencies when it comes to its soundstage. Now I should also quickly mention that the virtualize option does hinder the overall accuracies throughout the mid-range and the highs, and as a result I left it disabled. Of course it does give you a little bit of extra sort of width and depth, but at the expense of taking away from the overall frequency range and also decreasing the accuracy, meant that it's not an option that I would personally recommend, and indeed is not one that I actually used. So with all of that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict, and you can potentially see where I'm going with this. The B&O Stage has got good competencies across the frequency range. It's very stylish and has got a comprehensive app and different features that are built in. However, fundamentally, it doesn't have a subwoofer, nor does it also have support for DTS or DTSX, and furthermore, its driver and channel configuration is quite limited in comparison to what else you can find out there in the market. Frankly, if I was picking a soundbar at this price point, I'd look at alternatives from Creative and Samsung, and if you've got a little bit more budget to spend and you want the best all-in-one soundbar experience, you should just get the Sennheiser Ambeo Soundbar instead. That is, of course, my own personal recommendations, and the reviews and the links to these soundbars that I've mentioned will be down in the description below for your own consideration. If you've liked this independent detailed review, definitely do drop a like, subscribe and hit that bell notification, all of which are greatly appreciated and allows me to continue delivering honest reviews like this one. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.